Welcome and thank you for joining us for this virtual event on post-conflict accountability in Liberia. My name is Jennifer Prestholt and I direct the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. This event is the last in a series that we have hosted in the lead up to the 36th session of the Universal Periodic Review Working Group in November 2020. The Advocates for Human Rights is a non-governmental organization based in the United States. The Advocates works to implement international human rights standards in order to promote civil society and reinforce the rule of law. One of the ways that we do so is by collaborating with partners to build their capacity to engage in advocacy at the United Nations. You'll hear from some of our Liberia-based partners today, but I'd also like to draw attention to all of the organizations that are working together on this important issue in Liberia. Thank you to the Center for Justice and Accountability, the Center for Civil and Political Rights, the Civil Society Human Rights Advocacy Platform of Liberia, Civitas Maxima, Global Justice and Research Project, Human Rights Watch, and the Secretariat for the establishment of a War Crimes Court in Liberia for co-sponsoring this event. The purpose of this event is to provide updated information on the current situation in Liberia to assist delegates to the Human Rights Council in preparing their interventions for the UPR Interactive Dialogue in November. I'll provide a brief introduction to the topic, and then I'll turn the floor over to our panelists to offer specific recommendations that they would like you to make for Liberia and to explain why those recommendations are important. Before we begin, a couple of logistical points. We invite you to submit questions by using the Q&A function. We've also prepared a one-pager with a top-level summary of our priority recommendations on this for Liberia. If you have not received that one-pager, please email my colleague Elizabeth Lacey, ELACY@advrights.org, and she'll send them to you. We'll put Elizabeth's email in the chat. This is a public side event. We are recording this event and we will publish the video on the Advocates YouTube channel in the next few days. If you would like a link to the YouTube recording, you can contact Elizabeth Lacey. So first, let me introduce our speakers today. With the caveat that Liberia is having some problems with internet connectivity. So I'll introduce the speakers. Hassan Bilati has not been able to join us yet, but will hopefully be joining us soon. But let me begin with Adama K. Dempster. Adama is a Liberian human rights and justice campaigner with over 10 years of experience in the field of human rights. He currently serves as the Secretary General of the Civil Society Human Rights Advocacy Platform of Liberia and coordinator of the human rights community in Liberia. He also serves as an ambassador of Liberia and to Liberia Global Rights Tracker, Human Rights Measurement Initiative, HRMI, which measures human rights performance, the human rights performance of countries. In addition, he's a co-campaigner of the Secretariat for the Establishment of War and Economic Crimes Court for Liberia. Mr. Dempster was the head of delegation for civil society human rights groups to the UN Human Rights Committee for the periodic review of Liberia's compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 2018. Hassan Bilati is a prominent Liberian human rights activist, investigator, and director of the Monrovia-based Global Justice and Research Project, GJRP. GJRP documents war-related crimes in Liberia and seeks justice for victims in partnership with national and international non-governmental organizations, as well as national authorities investigating and prosecuting extraterritorial criminal cases. So welcome to our speakers. Let's get started with just a little bit of context. First, a word about the work of the Liberian TRC and the conflict in Liberia. Widespread and systematic abuses of international human rights and violations of international humanitarian law characterized Liberia's brutal armed conflicts from 1989 to 2003, the period that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Liberia, or TRC, was mandated to document. The TRC was negotiated and agreed upon in the August 2003 Comprehensive Peace Agreement and subsequently enacted into law by the National Transitional Legislative Assembly in 2005. The TRC was established to promote national peace, security, unity, and reconciliation, and at the same time make it possible to hold perpetrators accountable for gross human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law that occurred in Liberia between January 1979 and October 2003. The TRC began its work in 2006 and ultimately collected more than 20,000 statements from Liberians in Liberia and in the diaspora. After examining the statements, the TRC held public hearings throughout Liberia and in diaspora in the United States. The TRC of Liberia concluded its work on June 30th, 2009, and presented its final report in 2009 containing findings, determinations, and recommendations made by the TRC to the National Legislature. The TRC report concluded that all warring factions were implicated in serious human rights abuses. The TRC specifically recommended the establishment of an extraordinary criminal court for Liberia, a hybrid international national chamber to try individuals accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other serious violations of international humanitarian law. The TRC also recommended that reparations be paid to victims. And yet the Liberian government has failed to take concrete action to hold accountable those responsible for atrocities committed during the conflict period. Nor has Liberia enacted legislation necessary to provide victims with an effective remedy. So fast forward 10 years, almost 10 years, and Liberia's most recent periodic review by the UN Human Rights Committee for compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights took place in July of 2018. The NGOs present today were also part of a coalition of 76 organizations, including 56 Liberian NGOs and 20 international organizations that submitted a written report to the Human Rights Committee that highlighted the, quote, failure of the government of Liberia to undertake fair and credible prosecutions of international crimes committed in Liberia during armed conflict between 1979 and 2003, and to end impunity for the Civil War era crimes. In its concluding observations, the UN Human Rights Committee stated regards to impunity and past human rights violations, that they regretted that very few steps, and here I quote, were taken to implement the bulk of the recommendations issued by the TRC in 2009. The committee notes with concern that none of the alleged perpetrators of gross human rights violations and war crimes mentioned in the Commission's report have been brought to justice, and that some of those individuals are or have been holding official executive positions, including in the government. It also notes that with concern the absence of a comprehensive program of reparations for victims. The committee is concerned that such a situation fosters a climate of impunity and fails to achieve transitional justice. The committee notes the information provided by the delegation related to the new government's intention to issue a statement shortly on the measures it plans to take to implement the Commission's report. The committee went on to recommend to the government of Liberia, as a matter of priority, that it should establish first a process of accountability for past gross human rights violations and war crimes that conforms to international standards, including concerning independence and expertise of the judiciary, victims' access to justice, due process and fair trial guarantees, and witness protection. The state party should in particular, A, ensure that all alleged perpetrators of gross human rights violations and war crimes are impartially prosecuted and if found guilty, convicted and punished in accordance with the gravity of the acts committed, regardless of their status or any domestic legislation on immunities, and remove any persons who are proven to have been involved in gross human rights violations and war crimes from official positions. B, take all necessary measures to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and consider establishing a well-resourced body comprising government representatives, the National Independent Human Rights Commission, and civil society organizations to monitor the implementation of those recommendations. C, develop and implement a comprehensive reparations scheme for all victims. And D, redouble its efforts aimed at fostering reconciliation and sustaining peace with the participation of victims and their families, as well as civil society organizations active in seeking justice for past crimes. So those were the priority recommendations of the Human Rights Committee in July of 2018. The Liberian government promised to immediately respond with its position on implementing the recommendations made by the TRC, and the government of Liberia has yet to do so. Further, the committee, pursuant to the committee's rules of procedure, Liberia was requested to provide by 27 July 2020 information on the implementation of the above recommendations made by the committee. It's now October of 2020, and the government has failed to submit its follow-up report to the committee, even though it was due more than 2 months ago, on the implementation of its priority recommendations related to impunity and past human rights violations. So that's the context in which our discussion today happens. And now I would like to turn it over to Mr. Adama K. Dempster to speak a little bit more about the current situation in Liberia. Adama, are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone. Am I much clearer? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay. So again, it is an honor to form part of this meeting where we have the opportunity to speak with the UN Human Rights Council members with reference to Liberia's own accountability process. I'll give you a brief analysis of grassroots civil society movement to end impunity for war crimes in Liberia between 2018 to 2020. In 2018, civil society engagement and participation with the UN Human Rights Committee review process supported the outcomes of the UN concluding observation on the initial report on Liberia. In November 2018, as a follow-up to the concluding observation, a National Justice Conference was held in Monrovia, where over 200 participants from national and international human rights and justice institutions gathered in a single room. Members of government representatives, including members from the Liberian Senate and the House of Representatives, were all present. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, diplomatic missions, former commissioners of the TRC, religious members, traditional and war victims all attended the national conference. Following the national conference in November 2018, a march for justice in demand for justice and accountability for past crime was also held, where over 3,000 peaceful protesters marched on the principal street of Monrovia in demand for the implementation of the TRC recommendation and subsequently the establishment of a War and Economic Crimes Court. In addition to the quest for justice, in July 2019, a national legislative conference was held. The conference was held under a theme, Justice and Accountability, to address past crimes in Liberia. Both houses, that includes the House of Senate and the House of Representative members, gathered in the day-long conference. Out of the conference, a resolution was signed by 54 members of the House of Representatives against 73 members of that august body, calling for the establishment of a War and Economic Crimes Court. And the resolution was sponsored by a joint committee from the House of Representatives. As we stand, that resolution has been signed, but has since been blocked by the current Speaker of the House of Representatives, Honorable Buffer's Chamber. In addition to the quest for justice, in April 2009, the Liberian National Bar Association, in a subsequent support for justice and accountability during its national convention, endorsed a resolution calling for the establishment of War and Economic Crimes Court. And the Bar Association went further to have set up a committee that had the task of drafting a bill calling on the establishment of War and Economic Crimes Court. The bill had been drafted and the draft is in the possession of the Bar Association currently. In September 2019, the National Council of Chiefs and Elders of Liberia organized and sponsored a national conference, which concluded with a resolution calling for a War and Economic Crimes Court to be established for Liberia. Based on all of these efforts, a national conference, a national economic dialogue was held in September 2019, where over 350 participants from the 15 political subdivisions of Liberia, members of the diplomatic mission, civil society, the National Legislature business community gathered. During the conference, the participants resolved and submitted a joint recommendations that include, among other things, calling for the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the establishment of War and Economic Crimes Code. At the end of the economic dialogue, the President of the Republic of Liberia, President George Weah, accepted and assured participants to fully implement the recommendations coming out of the economic dialogue, which is yet to be done. Based on this development, President Weah, in September 2019, he sent a letter to the National Legislature asking them to advise and provide guidance on all legislative and other necessary measures towards the implementation of the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, including the establishment of War and Economic Crimes Code. However, since that time, the legislature speaker has blocked the resolution in calling for the establishment of War and Economic Crimes Code. In addition, the UN Human Rights Committee required that Liberia report on July 27, 2020 on the implementation of its concluding observation, which has not been done. All of these efforts have been described by civil society, human rights activists, and war victims as an unwillingness and lack of interest for justice and accountability by the government. Contrary to the government implementing the recommendations and ensuring the protections of war victims and addressing past crimes, Liberia now has found itself in a corridor where increasing parade of former generals and rebels calling themselves former general association continue to enjoy top positions of government at the level of national security and other areas of government sector. This has increasingly raised eyebrow and concern among the publics and war victims. In addition to our work, there are a couple of challenges that civil society activists, war victims continue to experience. Some of the challenges include lack of safe and enabling environment for these individuals and actors to do their work in pursuit for accountability and justice across the country. Another challenge has to do with unwillingness on the part of government, especially the Speaker of the House of Parliament, to put the resolution calling for the establishment of War Crimes Code on the plenary floor for decision. As a result of not addressing past crimes, there have been increasingly crimes being committed on a daily basis in Liberia. And of course, evidence to that there have been insecurity, mysterious deaths occurring in the corridors of Liberia on a weekly basis. This is worrisome and remain a huge concern for Liberians. We have a couple of recommendations, but in addition to our recommendation, we also think that lack of strong international push on the government to ensure its compliance with the July 2018 UN Human Rights Committee observation recommendation is of concern. We think that international community should exert more pressure on the government. And it is also clear that international crimes are punishable under international laws. So the establishment of War and Economic Crimes Code, it has a bearing, international bearing, and the responsibility for the implementation also rests with the international community. In similar case, the Rwanda and Sierra Leone, Liberia is of no exception. So we think we need the international community, the UN, to stand up, to use this opportunity in the November review to put more pressure and ensure that Liberia address past atrocities, past crime, in order to sustain the peace on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adama, and thank you for making the point that the Universal Periodic Review process is an opportunity for members of the Human Rights Council to make strong recommendations that will have an impact on accountability in Liberia. So we'll come back to you in a few moments to talk more about your priority recommendations, but I would like to now turn the floor over to Mr. Hassan Bilati, who I'm very pleased to see has been able to join us join us despite the problems with connecting to the internet. So, Mr. Villati, you have the floor.
So Jennifer,
thank you very much. I'd like to, on behalf of the Global Justice Research Project, say thanks to everybody involved in making this work and to the Liberian human rights community, and of course, my own staff. I'll be talking about the movement for accountability through universal jurisdiction cases and how this has created a need for justice in Liberia. This is very important, and I'm quite happy that I'm talking about this. First, in 2012, I thought, being a resident of Boston at the time, that it was necessary we did something as Liberians, because in 2009, the TRC submitted its recommendation to the Liberian government. At that time, it appeared that the Liberian government was either unable or unwilling to do anything. So I, along with a Swiss Geneva-based lawyer, Alain Werner, agreed that we should do something. And I set up the Global Justice Research Project in Monrovia, and then I packed my bags, came to Liberia, and Alain Werner set up the Civitas Maxima. So around 2012, when we started, many Liberians were very much afraid to even talk about these things because there were so many warlords in government, and many of them were still alive, strong, kicking in Monrovia. So many Liberians were very much nervous about calling for this sort of prosecution, even though some did stand up. So we started our work, and people didn't really trust that this could work. So in 2014, in collaboration with the Belgian authorities, a suspected Liberian war criminal was arrested in Belgium. And then the same 2014, another suspected Liberian war criminal was arrested in Switzerland. And then the Liberian people who were very much afraid at that time began to believe in a possibility of justice. And then there were arrests made in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and then followed by France, and now the latest one in Finland. And what this did was it shifted the fear from the side of the victims towards the perpetrators. So the perpetrators began to be afraid, and they began to organize themselves, putting in place some of their former wartime structures, command structures, to intimidate human rights workers. But the good thing is, this series of arrests encouraged the Liberian people, having seen just over the horizon the possibility of holding these people accountable and nothing happening, because right now they're disarmed largely and they're not capable of doing anything. It made people to begin to call much louder on the Liberian people, on the Liberian government, starting from 2016, 17, 18 till date, calling on their government to make sure that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation's recommendations. Now, we have seen over the years, for the past 7+ years that we've operated, that the Liberian people have become emboldened, and they have turned into security largely for some human rights workers, especially when it comes to prosecution overseas. And at several conferences that we have held and meetings we have held with Liberian civilians all across the country, one of the main things that they always talk about is, why are these trials not being held in Liberia? And we've told them that, listen, it is your responsibility, it is our responsibility as Liberians to call on our elected officials, our government, to make sure that these trials that are held here. But in the absence of the unwillingness of the Liberian government to do so, we will continue to hold people accountable through cooperation, through the use of the universal jurisdiction, working with jurisdictional authorities from other countries to make sure that some of these people are held accountable before everybody dies, you know? And this is important. A few of them have died, and which I will term as cheating justice. And then what we have begun to see is an orchestrated campaign by some of the former warlords to directly intimidate human rights workers and to intimidate witnesses who have testified in previous cases, whether in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, or any other, in other areas. We are very much concerned about the return of several of them. One has returned from the United Kingdom, which posed a serious threat. That return posed a serious threat to us and to some of the witnesses. The return of two more from the United States. And then you also do have other perpetrators here in government, in the parliament, in the executive and legislative branches of government. And this is worrying. As my colleague earlier mentioned, I had the opportunity to sit and discuss with the speaker on the question of the implementation of the TRC report. And it seemed, I realized that there were so much misunderstanding on the part of many of them regarding what constituted war crimes. And, in a few short minutes, I was able to explain, to them, to the speaker, what does constitute war crimes, largely. But it seems to me, in my view, that some members of the legislature have some scores to settle because they seem to be concerned about the arrest of former President Ellen Johnson's servant. And my question to them was, read the TRC recommendation. It doesn't say criminally prosecute Ellen. It says Ellen should be barred from holding political offices for 30 years. So the TRC must have seen something and must have known that the evidence put forth did not constitute violations of IHL or international humanitarian law. Now, having said that, the Liberian people now have built hope, and this, they've seen overseas successes, and they now are very desperate in seeing it happen here. Many people want many of these trials to happen in Liberia. So what we've done is to go around and tell people these things never going to happen if you don't call on your elected representatives, to push for this to happen, because it has to be signed to law, and then the executive system, the executive branch of government will enforce it, because in our system, the executive branch of government enforces the law. So because the executive now has raised some technical issues, technical argument that, well, this is not our job to make the law. So talk to the lawmakers. And the biggest obstacle for now that I see is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Honorable Balfour Chambers. And I have a few recommendations to make, and I'll make when the time comes. But the Speaker has completely refused to allow alternative voices to be heard on the floors of the legislature. And we as non-governmental organizations are fully cognizant of the fact that the electorate who put these guys in position of power should be able to tell them what to do. Otherwise, they should also, they should get them out, vote them out, and vote in people who will make this happen. And there is no magic in the world. I can change the fact that these wartime crimes will have to be addressed by Liberia, either now or at any other time. Either Liberia does it or some other person will do it for them, as is now happening across North America and Western Europe, these arrests. And these arrests can't stop. Now, I must be honest to admit to a few things that the current government has done that I think have some semblances of cooperation. They have allowed, because we do investigations in Liberia on the ground, we document war-related crimes, and in working with jurisdictional authorities in other countries, we push for justice. So the government has done one thing so far that we think is a good step in the right direction. And that is, in the past, we tried to get authorization from the Liberian government, either through the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to allow foreign investigators, for example, from France, for example, from Belgium, from other countries, to come and investigate, war-related crimes here on the ground. That didn't happen in the past, but then in 2019, when we tried, we were able to get the current government to allow that. So since then, I must report that they've honored the request that we have submitted for them to allow jurisdictional authorities to come investigate Liberia. It is not like it is we who send it to them. Authorities from those jurisdictions submit those requests to them. So what they did in the past is stonewalled. They didn't say no, but they didn't do it. So this is one thing to report that that I believe is good in the right direction, because it's all not gloom and doom. And the second thing that I also want to report before I hang up is there is a system of intimidation, harassment against human rights defenders here, and especially the work we do, because former combatants have been fed with misinformation that if they sat there, other people are prosecuted, they're going to come after them to prosecute them. So we told them that, listen, fighting war is not a crime, not necessarily a crime. It is what you do during the war, So in terms of the intimidation and the attacks or whatever on human rights defenders, we do not have evidence yet to prove that these attacks have been state-sponsored. We don't have that evidence. What we do have is individuals working in government who threaten people, and private individuals from various warring factions and various political parties who have been threatening us and witnesses and other victims and other human rights defenders. So let me conclude to say this. The Liberian people generally are fired up. They're fired up. And I must also admit that the international community will have to lend helping hand to this. I understand that there has got to be a Liberian initiative. It has to be seen as driven by, led by Liberians. Of course, that's a fact, and that's the way it should be seen. But the Liberians themselves need push from the international community. Our deceitful, hypocritical, and deceitful politicians, irrespective of what side they may be on, have always compromised the call for justice for political convenience. And in my recommendation, I'm going to be an individual that I think that we as a group in terms of targeting some kind of specific sanction. I want to say thanks to everybody, and I'll be willing to take some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hassan. So let's move into the questions now. And the first question, I'll go to Hassan first, since your mic is still open. But what are your priority recommendations to address the quest for justice in Liberia?
First of all, recommend, well, there is something more important, but there is something that's really eating me up, and that is, I recommend, I don't know if we're able to do that, to bring pressure to bear on the speaker, targeted sanction against individuals who stand in the way of the realization or implementation of the TRC's recommendation. Targeted sanction, especially the speaker, because if he doesn't get our resolution on the floor, it's not going to be discussed. So we're going at no place if that is not the case. In addition to that, there are other individuals in government here that whose names should be highlighted as threatening people. My second recommendation is to call on the international community generally, not just, if we can include governments within that would be fine. But to make clear and direct statement to call on Liberian authorities to create a war crimes court. The reason for this is Liberian authorities, these hypocritical politicians keep telling the Liberian people that, oh, it is very expensive. We don't have money to do it. As if it is there, we're going to pay for it. Of course, if the Liberian government is able to pay, it's some international obligation. So a very strongly worded statement from the international community to the Liberian government through the president and to the legislature to say that this is an obligation, you're going to have to do this. And third, to make sure that individuals in government who are threatening people, human rights defenders, they should be outed. And this is very, very important. To out individuals who threaten human rights defenders, to out them. And of course, fourth, to provide more coordination between the international human rights organizations and local human rights work. I know that that is there, but just to have that a little more enforced. And the last one goes to Liberian human rights organizations. We, in all honesty and fairness, are a little bit disjointed. We're not as organized as we should be. And this is a fact, because as we're here, there are other human rights organizations that don't even know, are not even aware that this is happening. So we're a bit, this call comes to ourselves. I recommend this to ourselves. We have to show more coordination. Otherwise, the effort of the international community is not going to go anyplace. But my first priority recommendation, to fight for, advocate, lobby for targeted sanctions. Of course, I put that to a U.S. Congressman from Colorado, and he said he would think about that. It didn't say it would be a priority or not, but currently in the U.S., of course, you have the election stuff coming up. But if this happens, definitely, it will definitely, in my opinion, lead to the creation of a war crimes court, because no Liberian government or public official wants to be seen as doing stuff to which the United States is opposed. And this is innate, that is an inborn tendency for Liberia. Call on the U.S. government to help in this direction. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those priority recommendations. Let's turn now to Adamas for the same question. What are your priority recommendations to address the current situation in Liberia?
Okay, I think a much tougher measures has to be taken because over the time there have been an increased local support and demand for accountability for past crime. That is evidence to most of what I highlighted in my presentation. And in order to achieve the overall, we now need the international pressure. In the absence of international pressure, things are not really working on the ground. One of the priority areas that we thought the president would have ventured, the president would have actually taken an action during the 75th address at the UN General Assembly was to renew his previous call that was made at the 74th session at the General Assembly, where he committed Liberia before the international community, requesting the time, venue, and funding to ensure the establishment of War and Economic Crimes Court. I think that statement should be revisited by the international community because it is a commitment that the president made, and let not use the international stage just for making vague statements. So we want the human rights and the international community to go back to the President 74th commitment he made before the General Assembly to use that on grounds to put pressure on the government to set up the War and Economic Crimes Court. That is very important for us. On the overall, more advocacy on the ground remain as a priority, like what we are doing with the international group, like Advocate, Human Rights Watch, a regular follow-up to ensure that the pressure that have been going on continues so that we do not lose sight of the opportunity that we have at hand now. So we look forward to keeping the flames in our work on this issue of addressing past accountability issues on the ground.
Thank you very much. So as I understand, one of your priority recommendations is that the executive should endorse the legislature's resolution to support a war crimes court, and that the government should be requesting assistance from the international community in funding that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the chat, so let me ask those next. So this, maybe we'll go to, well, I'll ask the questions and then you can decide who wants to go first. What leverage does the international community have to assist in moving this process along in Liberia? And two, what happens if there is no movement towards justice in Liberia?
So first of all, we need to highlight and remind ourselves and also remind the government that the United Nations Human Rights Committee concluding observations issue 2018 is evidence to ensuring that the issue of accountability be addressed in Liberia. So that alone is a milestone, is a strong document. The recommendations made by the committee is very strong to the extent that requested that those accused of gross human rights violation serving in political position be removed. And that is something, that is a recommendation that we think it is needed to be implemented now, because Liberia now faces numerous insecurity situations because former warlords and rebel generals are enjoying, like I said earlier, and are sitting in top government position, including the national security. So that's where it tells you that if Liberia had implemented the UN concluding observation, most of these actors that are listed in the TRC report would not have paraded the street of Liberia or moving in the corridor. So that is very important. I remember there was a resolution from the US Congress that was issued calling for the implementation of the TRC recommendation. Those are all milestone recommendations. But what has happened to those recommendations? There has to be a follow-up. There has to be a rigorous follow-up on those recommendations. Other than that, the government isn't seeing any pressure, so they continue to exhibit and carry out like nothing is happening on the ground. But on the overall, it is important that we go back to the recommendation, the resolutions that have been put forth, recommendations that have been put forth by the international community to be able to ensure that the government implement. On the other hand, I think the aspect of not implementing the TRC report, establishing a war crimes code, had created so much fear in Liberia where, I said earlier, insecurity, mysterious death, secret killings are taking place on a daily basis, only because we have not implemented, and impunity has become the order of the day in Liberia. The fear now is that we are afraid that Liberia should not slip back into conflict, because these are evidence of some of the very things that happened in the 1990s before the war came to. So it is important that the human rights communities, that news articles that are right now.
All right.
Okay, I think we lost the last
right.
the last bit of that. You were saying the evidence. Okay, maybe we'll just go to Hassan. Did you hear the question, Hassan?
Yeah.
There were two related questions.
Yeah.
What leverage?
What
Yeah.
what to be done if nothing is done? First of all, I like to be very clear and no more pragmatic. The international community has a huge leverage over Liberia, the Liberian government. First, a large chunk of the Liberian budget comes from the international community, U.S., EU, United Nations, World Bank, so on and so forth. There has got to be a way to bring some pressure to bear on them as some condition to receiving some of these aids and grants. We have to be clear about that. So the internet, especially for the United States, I don't think it should be difficult for the United States. The difficult part would be to get an American government official willing to clearly, publicly make a statement and just mention Liberia's name. In Liberia, traditionally, no Liberian president or government official wants to be seen as either at loggerhead with the U.S. government, any U.S. government, or as being ostracized by the U.S. government. In fact, in the mix of politics here in Liberia, people try to win political points over their friend by saying that the U.S. does not like this person. So the U.S. has huge leverage. The international community, donor community, they have a huge leverage because they give us money. They give our government money. So this is clear. Second, so if nothing happened as a result of some of the, if the government is still remains obstinate and buries its heads in the sand, and therefore I think that the targeted sanction that I recommended earlier should be broadened to include other individuals that may be serving as hindrances to justice in this area. The politician, if we don't do this, no government is going to take action. They're more concerned about being elected and staying in power. So everything else they tell the international community is cosmetic. They don't really mean it. So one concrete action, if these recommendations aren't implemented, can go a long way in making sure that it happens. No government, certainly not this one, wants to be perceived as ostracized. So I think the international community, in my view personally, owes Liberia. They've done something for Sierra Leone, the special court. It did something for Rwanda. It did something for the former Yugoslavia. The Lebanon tribunal, they owe us. They do owe us as Liberians. Maybe we may not be very important, but they should also understand that we're humans. We have lives. And there has got to be something done by them. Bring pressure to bear, put targeted sanctions.
Thank you very much. And the second part of the question has to do with what if there is no movement towards justice in Liberia. I think you both made reference to the fact that there's widespread support for justice in Liberia. Would you like to comment on that as well? How widespread among the grassroots, among different sectors of society, is the support for justice and accountability in Liberia?
All right, can I take that?
Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, we have a program called Outreach. And in this outreach, we meet CBO, that is community-based organizations, we meet former combatant groups across Liberia, we meet women's group, we meet victims group. We conduct workshops with them, we conduct interactive workshops, you know. The goal is to make them to understand their role in making sure that the War Crimes Code is created, and the meanings of the crimes and all of these things, that their responsibility and the responsibility of their lawmakers, of the government officials that they elect. So everywhere we have gone, from Cape Mount to Cape Palmas in Maryland, from Grand Cape Mount County to Maryland County, from Lofa County to Montserrado County, from Greenville, Sano County to my hometown in South Liberia, Nima County. People come forward every day. How can we help? And it is because of the willingness and openness of those participants and other people that, you know, we at the Global Justice Research Project have become a little bit emboldened. We see the public largely as our security. And I'll tell you, maybe they don't want to be named. There are so many people in the Liberian Senate, including a former instructor of mine at the University of Liberia, whom I'm not going to name. They support it in the legislature. They do support it. Even in the current opposition, there are so many people who support it. It is almost like if someone wants to gain some kind of fame, politically or otherwise, they talk about war crimes. You know, so that's how widespread it is. In addition to that, many of the organizations that we conduct outreach, thanks to the African Transition and Justice Group for providing funding for that, many of them have organized themselves, even the former combatants. And one way that we get information regarding threats, of course, comes from some former combatants. So this is how widespread it has become. In the past, they always told them that if you sat there and they prosecuted your brother, they're going to come after you. Because of our outreach to them to tell them, listen, fighting war, being an NPFA, ULIMO in itself is not an international crime. What you do, what you did in the past during the war, which will constitute violate international humanitarian law, those will be crimes, you know, or war crimes. So this sort of information has emboldened people, because other people thought that even if they morally supported an NPFL, they will be considered of having committed crime. No. So it is very, very, very widespread. And our outreach goes to schools. So it is widespread to the extent some politicians feel uncomfortable to even talk about it. And I have to admit that one of the reasons that it's making it difficult to create a war crimes court in Liberia is political. Probably the main reason. I come from Nima County, so from statistics, no presidential candidate has won elections in Liberia since 1985 without winning Nima County. And you have an individual from there, my senator, named in the terrorist's recommendation, so nobody wants to offend him. And this is, in my mind, I'm sorry to say, but ridiculously outrageous, you know? So it suggests, as long as he has the support, political support, votes behind him, we're not going to be able to do anything. And this is why I recommend targeting specific government officials in this respect.
Great, thank you very, very much. Adam, I think we lost you for a moment, but you're back. Do you have a comment on how widespread the call for justice is in Liberia?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, the issue of addressing past crime remains a priority. It's a high-level priority and concern for the ordinary citizens, war victims, and all sectors in different spheres of the Republic. Or as a result of most of the issues that are occurring right now, people are comparing them to what happened during the civil conflict. So what we've done in recent time, that is 2020, we, at the grassroots level, we have continued and remain committed to creating awareness and educating people, both the religious community, also from Bond County, where the NPF, Charles Taylor had his headquarters during the 1990s. They have actually invited our group, the Civil Society Platform Independent Human Rights Investigator, to educate them on the issue of the TRC, where we reference to accountability and the issue of reparation. And they also wanted to have a clear picture of the individuals that are listed in the TRC to enable them inform their vote, the election that is about to come up. So most of them are saying that they don't want to go into an election where they're going to be continually electing warlords and people who committed atrocities. So we engaged with that, and we remain very much engaged with that. We had an opportunity with the people in Grand Bassa, where you had the port city in Buchanan. They also have had the opportunity to seek audience and information on the issue of accountability, TRC report, reparation, and most of the people that have actually come forward are war victims. And we're interested to know that war victims are now coming up and they are interested because they have lived in fear, thinking that had they had the opportunity to speak against rebels and people who committed atrocities, they were going to be haunted. And they realized that either way, because nothing is working for them. So remaining silent and have no bearing, no help. So they have sought information and clarity, and using it now, they are establishing War Victim Association. I can tell you right now, there's 30 war victims, people who have grave issues from the Civil War back in the 1990s. They have organized themselves into a War Victims Association in Grand Bassa. We are also working with them. The same thing happened in Bond County. You have the War Victims Association that is operated, and then they also are looking up to us to empower them in terms of provide information so that they use that as a grassroots and citizens' ownership to engage the local authorities, members of the legislature, so that they will use the opportunity to demand that these legislators take action to implement the TRC recommendation and the resolution that is on the floor, that is within the corridor of the House of Representatives. So again, you will continue to hear that efforts have been made on the ground, but the government continue to play in a laissez-faire, don't care attitude and not taking any action. So we thought that more engagement with the international community right now, that is a two-way. And this will actually shake the government. This will actually move the government to take some tangible and strict actions when it comes to implementing the TRC report and establishing war crimes court.
So widespread support for a war crimes court and little government action, but the international community's response can help to move that process along, as I understand what you're both saying. So we have time for one last question, and I would like to go back to the reference that you both made to human rights defenders who are working for a court are experiencing threats in conducting their work. I understand journalists also are receiving threats. Can you comment a little bit on what human rights defenders need to provide protection? Is there a specific law protecting human rights defenders in Liberia?
Yes.
Just please comment on your recommendations on that. Adama, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah. So importantly, since the adoption of the International Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, Liberia remains a country with no laws. no policy to protect human rights defenders at national level. We have no law, we have no policy. The issue of reprisal against human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers remain a serious problem on the ground, especially with respect to actors who are speaking against impunity and human rights violations committed during the Civil War. So we have said over and over, until we have law, because in the human rights work, it is backed by laws. And if you do not have a law, there is no reliance, there is no protection, there is no way you can hold anyone accountable. So given the fact that we have a declaration on the protection of human rights defender, we think that Liberia in the recommendation should develop and enact specific law and policy to recognize and protect the work of human rights defenders on the ground. This is very key. And we also want the government to demonstrate, political support for human rights defenders on the ground. That has to do with even the office of the president, members of the legislature, to be able to stand up in support for human rights defenders on the ground is very important. And some of the things that Liberia continue to suffer is that we have not had the opportunity for special rapporteur, the Human Rights Council experts, to actually visit Liberia on the issue of human rights defenders. This is very key. We think if it would be for the first time, we need a special rapporteur on human rights defender to visit Liberia. Like this, it will elevate the debate, the issue, the concerns surrounding human rights defender protection. These are all important, action that we require that the council should recommend or should take an action that will help Liberia amidst most of the grave threat, intimidation. I think you all are aware that myself, Hassan, and other people have come under immense threat and intimidation a couple of months ago. And these threats are not just mere threat, they are serious, and they have caused us to readjust our movement to the extent of changing our vehicles, and even our getting out in public places have been restricted to some extent. So we think to continue and foster the work as human rights defenders, campaigners for justice, the international community need to come very strong on this issue of protecting human rights defenders.
Thank you, Adama. So concrete recommendations that the legislature should pass a law to protect human rights defenders in Liberia, and request that the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders conduct a country visit. Hassan, would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, sure. So before I answer the question, I'd like to quickly remind ourselves that in terms of how widespread the support for it is, the Liberia Council of Churches has openly come out to support the creation of outcome code. So that is very important. Thanks to Reverend Dr. Porto Brown. So in terms of recommendation, I come from the Global Justice Research Project, so we don't make too many friends because our jobs, our documentation put people in jail, but we don't have too many friends. So you talk about threats, and in the Liberian context, what I have seen being helpful, of course, in addition to enacting the law like was done for journalists, the Kamara law, in addition to similar law being passed for human rights defenders, it is very important, one, for the international community, that like the last, I think about a couple of months ago, 6 or 8 weeks ago, when human rights organizations issued a press statement regarding the threats that were posed to human rights workers and victims and witnesses. That sort of things goes a very long way. I know that from practice, from my day as a journalist, so I know that. Highlighting threats to human rights defenders in Liberia, naming names, if possible. Second, there has got to be a way to make the Liberian government to make public statements regarding committing itself to protecting human rights defenders. My researchers go in the field to Foya, over 200 kilometers away from Monrovia, to Bonjima, to Nima, to Maryland, to Zuedru, and they're there alone to document war-related crimes, speak to witnesses and victims. So if there is a public commitment from the Liberian government through the office of the president, guaranteeing, committing itself to defend, to protect human rights defenders, that can be very, very, very hopeful. And such a statement, not just from the corridors of the executive mansion, but at some major public forum. This is very, very important for us. And of course, the last one here is, I have to say that the individuals in government who create these conditions, I'm not going to say purged, but there should be some pressure on the executive to get them out. There are specific individuals in government, specific individuals who do this for their personal benefit because some warlord has either paid them or has. We have a current case, an individual, I'm not going to name him, who was working in the office of a particular senator, had to be relocated and had to quit his job. I can't call the name on this platform, but this is very, very dangerous. So it's become a situation where the threat is now posed to human rights workers, human rights defenders, but the threat is now being gradually extended to those who cooperate with human rights defenders. And the people doing this, they're very small minority, very small minority. So holding the government feet to fire by making the government to commit itself to defending, to protecting human rights defenders. We can't wait till something happens. We have to take some action now. It may be too late if we want to wait. That will be, of course, I do support the other recommendations my colleague who spoke earlier talk about. But in addition to those, this will be very, very cardinal, especially Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, other organizations coming out with statement. Those can go a long way, and they mean a lot to Liberia. Maybe if you're not here, you don't know what it means, but it means a lot for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Hassan. And that's all the time we have today. So I'd like to thank both of our panelists for their excellent presentations, Mr. Hassan Bility and Mr. Adama Dempster. We appreciate all that you're doing for human rights in Liberia, and we hope you stay safe. I understand you're working in a very challenging environment. And we'd also like to thank all of the participants, and we'd like to thank the co-sponsors for this event. As I said at the beginning, we have been recording this, and so we can make that recording available for those of you who would like to look more carefully at the information provided and the very concrete and specific recommendations made by our panelists. So with that, I'd say thank you again, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep.